Hi everyone, welcome back to the Studio 515 RCM Level 9 History course. We are actually nearing the end of this Baroque era module, Module 1 of this Level 9 History course. But before we complete, we have one more piece to really dive deep into, and it's going to be a few lectures. And that is the Messiah, Handel's Messiah. This first lecture deals with Overture from the Messiah, and we're going to spend some time unpacking some terminology, some ideas, a little bit of theory flowing from this overture. So Handel composed Messiah in 24 days for a benefit concert in Dublin, which took place on April 13th, 1742 in Neil's Music Hall. Now, Charles Jennens was a close friend of Handel's and wrote the libretti for a great deal of Handel's works, such as Saul and Israel in Egypt, and did so for Messiah as well. I don't know how much work was involved in creating this libretto, frankly, since the text draws very heavily on the Old and New Testaments of the Bible. Now, interestingly, Jennens wasn't actually the biggest fan of Handel's work on Messiah, and he wrote, and I quote here, "Handel has made a fine entertainment of Messiah, though not near so good as he might and ought to have done. I have, with great difficulty, made him correct some of the grossest faults in the composition, but he retained his overture obstinately, in which there are some passages far unworthy of Handel, but much more unworthy of the Messiah." Those are some pretty harsh words from Handel's partner in crime here. So I'm not going to try to sway you as to the merits of this overture, but obviously Handel thought it was good enough to publish. Jennens didn't. I'll let you make your own decision about that. All of that being said, Messiah has lived on in just this extreme popularity, and we can see it as the culmination of Handel's diverse musical sensibilities. We have a French overture, of Italian recitatives and arias, which we're going to talk about more. We have German counterpoint, as well as English choral writing. Just so you know, nice little bit of information to have. So you see on your screen, it says Messiah and then HWV 56. HWV is the cataloging system developed in the late 20th century by Bernard Basselt for all of Handel's known music. It's basically the opus numbering system for Handel's works. So what are our performing forces in Messiah? Well, we have four soloists. We have a soprano, an alto, a tenor, and a bass. Then we have a chorus in SATB form. So also soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, but full sections. Then we have our orchestra, which has string orchestra plus continuo. And then we also have oboes, bassoons, trumpets, and timpani. Messiah tracks the prophecies of the coming of Jesus Christ, his earthly life, and then the resultant effects of that life. So in part 1 of Messiah, we have the prophecy of the coming of Christ as well as his birth. In part 2, we deal with his suffering, death, and the spread of his teachings. And then in part 3, the redemption of the world through faith. We're going to be focusing on selections from parts 1 and 2 in these lectures and don't touch part 3 at all. Let's deal with the overture. The title of this overture is Symphony in the original score, and the genre is French overture. So what's an overture, and what makes this one a French one? The French overture is a Baroque orchestral genre which often serves as the orchestral introduction to an opera or an oratorio. The French overture was first developed at the court of King Louis XIV of France by Jean-Baptiste Lully, and it's generally composed in two parts. We have this first part, which is slow, it's homophonic in texture, and features this stately dotted figure. Then we have a second part, which is fast in tempo and imitative in structure. Our tempo term is grave, which indicates that this is a slow and solemn piece, which is in keeping with this stately sensibility that we get with French overtures in general. Our texture is homophonic and homorhythmic. Now, what does that mean? Well, strictly speaking, and I'm giving you the definition that the RCM offers here, homorhythmic texture is a texture which occurs when all voices sing or play the same rhythm, the same time. This results in a blocked chordal texture, which is known as homophonic texture. Homorhythmic texture allows the given text to be delivered with clarity and emphasis. So I need to offer some clarification here, because the definition upon your screen for homophonic texture is what I offered you before. If you remember, RCM doesn't, in their textbook for this course, actually give us a proper definition of homophonic texture. It says, go look in the glossary for the definition, and then in the glossary there's no definition, which is less than helpful. So we went to the New Oxford American Dictionary and got this definition, which says that homophonic texture is music characterized by the movement of accompanying parts in the same rhythm as the melody. Now, I think that the distinction between homophonic texture and homorhythmic texture is frankly a little bit arbitrary. Now, take some time to follow along here. It gets pretty confusing pretty fast with homophonic and homorhythmic, which sort of actually proves my point. So if we have homorhythmic texture, rhythmic texture, it is necessarily homophonic as well. It's homophonic by definition. But there's a bit of a question mark as to whether homophonic texture must also be homorhythmic as well. So homorhythmic texture must be homophonic, but we're not sure if homophonic must be homorhythmic. Now, the New Oxford definition that I offered above is a bit misleading because it makes it seem like homophonic texture must necessarily be homorhythmic as well. And like I said, we're not sure about that. A homophonic texture is sometimes described as texture in which all the voices are serving a single melodic line. And this is contrary to polyphony, where multiple melodic lines might be occurring at once. Think of a few where we have all these statements and they're just overlapping each other. It's like little bullets firing off. Now, the way I see it, there's a problem with this melody-based definition. So if we have a melody which is served by other melody-like fragments, if the primary melody is held up and supported by other melody-like or melodic-like fragments, that is not simply chordal accompaniment, but still existing to support the melody. Do we have polyphony or homophony? Well, for myself, I'd lean to it being more polyphony because we have a primary melody, but other melodies might be there to support it. But perhaps some might say that's homophony minus the homorhythm. And you can kind of see how this gets extraordinarily arbitrary, extraordinarily fast. If you're asked to define homophonic texture, you can potentially say that it's music characterized by accompanying parts acting in service of a single melody. But that's potentially just as inaccurate as our New Oxford definition above. If you're looking to get really specific, you could say that it's music characterized by accompanying parts acting in service of a single melody, which often presents itself in conjunction with homophonic rhythm. That should satisfy the RCM powers that be, or you could play it, I'm not actually sure if this is playing it safe, but you could offer the definition they have on the screen, music characterized by the movement of accompanying parts in the same rhythm as the melody, and just write, this is what the New Oxford American Dictionary says. If you disagree with me, you can sort of take it up with them. Our predominant rhythm in this overture is a dotted figure. If you recall our French overture definition from a few minutes ago, the A part of an overture, of a French overture, is homophonic in texture, and it features dotted figures. This expresses a majestic and stately affect which, considering the genre originated in the court of King Louis XIV, this makes a lot of sense. So let's take a look at this overture. We're going to be using a piano reduction just so it's easier to look at on a small screen without you or I having to scroll around a lot. So as we have in the past, the timestamp for the overture where you should be listening to is in the top left of your screen, and the link is in the description. So we can see here that all of our parts are moving together. We have this consistent dotted rhythm. Now, an interesting thing about dotted rhythms in French overture is that the rhythm wasn't necessarily always strictly adhered to. So take a look what we have on the screen. We have a dotted quarter note followed by an eighth note. So that's this. If you divide it up, we basically have 3 eighth notes in that dotted quarter note followed by another eighth note. So 1 and 2 and da, 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 da. That rhythm is often done by students who are being lazy with their subdivisions as a triplet, erroneously made into a triplet, which means that now instead of having this exacting 1 and 2 and da, da, we've turned it into this sort of lilting figure of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Now, what players back in the day would have done, and this is getting into some performance practice stuff, is that instead of playing exactly what the page said, which is this, where we have a dotted quarter with an eighth, so check that out again, we're going to double dot. So the way a double dot works is you have your quarter note. The first dot is half the value of that quarter note. So we have a quarter note tied to an eighth note, and then that next dot is half the value of the previous dot, so it's a 16th. So we have a quarter tied to an eighth tied to a 16th, which means that what we have left over is a 16th. It makes it a much more exacting, almost militaristic-like figure. So instead of having 1 and 2 and, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4. Ta, ta ta, ta ta, ta ta. And like I said, while this double dotting practice was common, it wasn't actually notated. We just have a single dot in ink on the page, not 2. And not 16ths, we just have 8ths. So this is where performance practice knowledge and learning about history, it does inform how you play these pieces and understand them. Let's get into part B of this overture. Now our tempo sped up, we have allegro moderato, and our texture has moved from homophonic and homorhythmic into polyphonic and fugal. We have 3 voices, and the subject is introduced to us by the first violins and the oboes. And the type of answer is tonal, and the predominant affect that we're looking for here is energetic and lively. So give this a pause, again, and the timestamp's in the top left. So I've noted the starts of each of these fugal voices with red arrows, just so it's super clear to you where everything starts. Although after the Bach module, y'all are experts in fugues now, so this should be fairly self-explanatory for you. This fugue sort of drives us into the meat of the oratorio, which we're going to be dealing with in our next video. So just remember that if you have a 2-part piece where the first part is slow and dotted and the second part is fugal, you've got a French overture. Thanks, and I'll see you in our next video.